Hi friends, welcome back to my channel. Today I want to share with you my take on honest and inclusive American history. If you don't know me, my name is Jessie. I previously worked respite in New York City for special needs kids. I was laid off in March of 2020 due to the pandemic, and beginning in September of that same year, I refocused the purpose of my business to begin assisting families with homeschool and virtual learning. I have been promising to make this video for quite some time, and I have kind of put off making this video because I really wanted to do it right. It really matters to me to get it right. So I have taken a little bit of extra time. I've gathered some additional resources, and I've really tried to put a lot of thought behind what I am going to say. I do have stacks of books scattered all around, which I'm sure that you are not able to see. I think they're just out of the camera frame. But before I show you all of the resources that I want to share, I do want to answer three primary questions. And those are, how do I choose what I teach? How do I implement or apply what I choose to teach? And why does it matter? So the first of those questions, how do I choose what to teach? What I do is I go through the history curriculum that we're using for the year. As you may know, with the children that I currently tutor, one of them is in public school and one of them is full-time homeschooled. I will look through any curriculum that we are using, whether that is public, private, or homeschool, and I will take a look at the scope and sequence, and I will see what is being taught, and I will try to decide from there where I feel like there may be holes that need to be filled in, or where I feel like maybe the truest picture, the full story, is not being presented. So this year, using our homeschool curriculum as an example, I went through the scope and sequence for this year. It talked a lot about Christopher Columbus, discovering America, and it focused a lot on the colonies and the founding fathers and the formation of this country. But there was very little to be said about Native Americans who lived here previously. There was one lesson that talked about Native Americans on the plains and what their way of life was. There was also very little that was said about Black Americans, African Americans, and their contributions. There was a unit on slavery. And while it is important to educate about slavery, to teach our kids about slavery, to learn from history so that we do not repeat it, it is also not honest to only teach about slavery and to eliminate then the amazing accomplishments of Black innovators and the people who helped to shape this country, the people who continue to do amazing work to drive this country forward. I wanted a lot more of those voices, and I think that you will see that reflected in my resources. Now, when we're talking about how I implement or apply what I have decided to teach, I do that in a couple of different ways. I really try to choose age-appropriate resources, but also because I am the product of a public school system, for me that does also involve some deconstructing and reconstructing for myself. I have to know the history before I can teach the history to someone else. So one of the things that you will see kind of repeated as a pattern here is that I have a grown-up read, an older kid read, and then some younger kid reads as well that kind of all follow along the same thematic. And I put those together very deliberately because I wanted to have a little something for everyone. Like I said, I'm currently teaching a 4 and a 10-year-old, although they have very different requirements for what they're learning. And like I said, one is in public school, one is solely homeschooled. It does also make my life easier if I can share kind of along a similar plane. And I know that a lot of families have more than one child that they're homeschooling. And so hopefully the way that I kind of have put these things together will help you in the way that you are able to use this also in your own schooling. Now, another thing that I really like to do is I really like to include things like coloring pages and things like poetry that go along with sort of whatever we're teaching. So I find a lot of my coloring pages just as free printables on Google. I just Google the name of the person that we're learning about and then free coloring pages, and a million pop up from Pinterest and various blogs and resources. I do also, though, have for Black History, the ABCs of Black History. This is a great little book, and it just takes you through kind of a little coloring journey. As I'm doing read alouds, I give a coloring page so that hands and minds are kind of busy and working at the same time that ears are listening, right? So this is one of my favorite ways, and I do this even with the 10-year-old. I think even for older kids, this is a great way. And then also I have the ABCs of African American Poetry. And so this is another way, this is another resource. And this is an absolutely beautiful book. I don't know if you can see here. And it just talks about, it gives a letter, and then it gives kind of a little bit of a verse, and the person who wrote it as well is listed at the bottom. So these are two ways that I really like to implement these things into homeschool, at least virtual schooling in the way that I am doing it now. Why does this matter? So I kind of touched on this a little bit when I answered the first question, but one of the things that I want to say is, if we are only teaching about suffering, if we are only teaching about the experiences of Black Americans during the era of slavery, we are missing such a wealth of information. And we are pigeonholing people. We're putting people in a box. And that's not fair. It's not honest. It's not inclusive. It's not right. I feel very strongly that while it is important to tell these stories of the great suffering that has happened, we must also continue to tell the stories of celebration and of achievement, and to do that in a way that really centers Black voices, Latin voices, Native voices. It is incredibly important. I think also for children of color, representation matters so much. I am Asian American. My family is Japanese. My great-grandparents immigrated to Hawaii. So a lot of my family still lives in Hawaii, but I identify as an Asian American. And I think I was in my late 30s before I ever saw myself reflected in animation. So the movies that I was watching, the Disney movies that I was watching growing up, were things like The Little Mermaid, and which was one of my favorites, and Beauty and the Beast, and these kinds of stories. And it wasn't until very recent memory that we had the first Black princess, Tiana, from Princess and the Frog. And it wasn't until, although I know that there was Lilo and Stitch, it wasn't until Moana that we really had the first Pacific Islander princess, right? And so I waited a long time in my life, and I sat in the theater and I wept. I had underestimated the effect that that would have on me, to see myself and my story reflected in animation, reflected in this global picture hit, right? And so representation is very important for people of color, to see ourselves reflected in the pages of the books that we're reading and on the screen of the shows that we're watching is deeply important. But it's also important for Caucasian Americans to have this centering of voices that have often been marginalized. It's very important. If our children are only ever reading, or even predominantly reading, white authors, hearing the narratives of history told through white voices, that does have the ability to skew the lens and to normalize some of the things that have happened throughout the course of history over the arc of time in a way that is not helpful for us to move forward into the future. It matters a lot to me. So I said that I identify as an Asian American. I want to be very, very clear that my mother is half Japanese and half Caucasian. My father is half Native and half Caucasian. This is not in any way about hating on any one particular demographic. It is, however, about amplifying voices that have long been silenced. So with that said, let me go ahead and take you through some of the resources that I have. I'm going to do this kind of in chronological order. So I'm going to start with Indigenous voices, and then I'm going to move into Black history. I have some really great things that I have pulled to share with you. So this first little stack of books here is this. I'm not sure if you can see them all, but there's a few. And like I said, I have a little bit for every age range. So the first thing that I want to share is this really gorgeous book. This is called An Indigenous People's History of the United States. It's by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And this book is very similar to the books that I showed in my previous video where I talked about Pride resources and I had a Queer People's History of the United States. This is very similar. This takes you through a timeline from before the United States was formed all the way into the present day. And it talks about American history through a Native lens. There is also an Indigenous People's History of the United States for young people. And again, the same author. And this is more of like a late middle school or high school aged resource. And so like this would be high school or adult. This would be like middle school, high school. And like I said, I like to read the grown-up companion in advance and sort of get my timeline down, pull additional resources, get all of my things together, and then do this together as a study. So I do also have an Indigenous People's History of the United States for young readers. I did also pick up Indigenous Food Sovereignty in the United States. I think one of the things that people don't talk about enough is the lack of food security in Native American communities and how that specifically correlates to the loss of their land, the loss of their way of life so many generations ago, how that continues to affect those communities today. And there really is a push all across the U.S. and I would say also all across the world for Indigenous communities to regain their food sovereignty. And if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about that, this is a great book. Of course, as always, I'll link everything in the down bar. Now, for younger readers, I have this book, The Very First Americans. And this talks about people who lived on this land before it was, quote unquote, discovered, and before it became what is now the United States of America. This is a little thin book, and it's just a picture book, but it does have quite lengthy passages, lots of great information, and it talks about lots of the different tribes. It divides them into segments. So this is the Woodlands. I love this book. It's a really sweet little book. I also have We Are the Water Protectors, and so this talks a little bit about some of the things that have been happening around the pipeline debates, why that is so damaging to Native communities who have already lost so much. This book is absolutely beautiful on the inside. You can see maybe some of the art here. Another way that I really like to center marginalized voices in what I teach, especially when we're talking about Indigenous voices, is with folk tales. This is The Naked Bear, and this is Folk Tales of the Iroquois. And it's just a collection of stories, creation myths, and all different kinds of teachable moments. If we're only reading kind of Mother Goose and Grimm's fairy tales, we're losing a lot of narratives and voices that really matter. So I always recommend that you look up kind of the myths and the legends and the folk tales specific to the tribe that you're studying, and then implement some of those voices. Now for this next stack of things, I'm going to have to reach a little bit. So pardon my reach. I do also have kind of a collection specifically to Native Hawaiian history. And I think, it gets glanced over a lot, that Hawaiians have suffered many of the same atrocities and plights that mainland Native tribes have also suffered. but there has not been the same equal redress. It was just under Bill Clinton's administration in the 90s that the U.S. government acknowledged for the first time that Hawaii did not willingly relinquish her sovereignty and gave then a pathway for redress for Native Hawaiians. And this is a process that is really in its infancy, that we're beginning to see now Native Hawaiians being given sacred land and sites in which they can build communities again. And this is 2021. So that has been a very long time coming, and it's very unfortunate. So similar to what I just showed with those books, I do have Ancient History of the Hawaiian People. Now, this is a super academic read. A high schooler may be able to get through this, but this is really more of a educating our own selves as grown folks so that we can then teach little folks all about this kind of miraculous history of the Hawaiian people. So this book, as you may be able to tell, has super tiny print. It is quite stout. There are lots of footnotes. So like I said, very academic. It's an incredibly rich resource. And I purchased this at a bookshop called Namea Hawaii, and I love that bookshop. It's on Oahu, and they have tons of Native history, as well as books in Hawaiian language, as well as all kinds of like picture books for younger kids. It's an absolutely beautiful store. Their virtual footprint prior to COVID was quite small, and they have worked really hard to try to increase that a little bit. And I do purchase quite a lot from them because they are such a treasure, and I would hate to lose them. So I'll put the link to Namea Hawaii down in the down bar below, and I will also, if I can find this on the website, I bought this actually in the store, but if I can find it on the website, I will also link that. I do also have Hawaiian folk tales, and so again, similar to what I was saying about the previous book that I shared, this is a great way to really understand things like creation myths and, teaching morality through kind of this, through a Native Hawaiian lens. So again, Hawaiian folk tales. Another book that I would like to share with you is this book. It's called Hawaii Rising. It's by Sam Lowe, and it tells the story of the history and also the modern resurgence of wayfaring in Polynesian communities. When we talk about things like navigation and exploration, we talk a lot about people like Christopher Columbus and Captain Cook. But navigation was neither invented by nor exclusive to European communities. And this book is a great way to learn the other side of the story. This would also be a great complement to any study that you're doing about Captain Cook, as it was Captain Cook who claimed that he discovered Hawaii, although Hawaii was already populated. And as you may know, Captain Cook actually passed away in Hawaii following a battle with Native Hawaiians. So this would be a great complement to any study that your curriculum offers or brings forward for you to do about Captain Cook. I do also have this gorgeous little book. This is the story of the last reigning monarch in Hawaii. Again, as I said previously, Hawaii never willingly relinquished her sovereignty. The queen at the time did that under great duress and threat of war, and out of a great love and passion for her people, that she loved them so deeply that she wanted to spare them the suffering and the bloodshed that would come from war, and therefore permitted statehood to happen. So this is her life story, and it's an absolutely beautiful story. Again, I picked that up in person at Namea Hawaii a couple of years ago. This is also a great book. This is called Sacred Hula. When we're talking about atrocities that Native Hawaiian communities have experienced, one of the things that we have to talk about is the fact that in my grandparents' lifetime, so very recent history, Native Hawaiian language and hula and all of these aspects of Hawaiian identity were actually outlawed. They were made illegal. And again, it wasn't until the 1990s that Hawaii actually won a bid to be able to teach these things, Hawaiian language, for example, in their own school system to their own children. So this is a really gorgeous book. It talks about the historical hula and why that was sacred to Hawaiians. And, you know, it's not just a pretty thing that you see at a luau on vacation. It really has a purpose. And so this book it's just stunning. It's very compact and small, but there's lots of timelines and lots of really great information. So this is Sacred Hula. I do also have a couple of picture books and a couple of board books as well. So let's see, how do we want to do? So this is actually a picture book that is another sort of folktale. And the person who wrote this book actually has a very similar story to my grandfather. He was born on a sugarcane plantation, born into servitude, and grew up then to write this amazing book. His name is Wilfred Toki. My grandfather was born into a plantation, was born on a plantation in Maui, and this lovely gentleman was born on a plantation in Waimea, and he has written this absolutely beautiful legend that he has shared with all of us. So again, like these stunning traditional styled pictures. I do also have something, this book here, which is we are inspiring the stories of 32 inspirational Asian Americans. So again, not just telling the stories of suffering and loss, but also telling stories of celebration and achievement. This book is absolutely stunning, as I've said that about every book so far, I'm sure. And, you know, Asian American sentiment is once again really high in this country in a way that it hasn't been since the days following Pearl Harbor. And we are seeing a lot of violence against Asian communities, especially elderly Asian Americans. Even here in New York City where I live, which is the liberal bastion, and it's really heartbreaking, absolutely heartbreaking. And of course, you know, COVID is being cited as a reason, but there is never a reason. There is never, ever a reason. And so by telling these stories, we hope to somewhat humanize experiences and level the playing field a little bit so that no one in this country ever feels like they are better than someone else and therefore has the right to inflict violence upon them or to in any way push them to the margins or the sidelines. So this is, we are inspiring the stories of 32 inspirational Asian American women. This is by Angel Trazo. And then the last things that I have for Hawaiian history, although I could talk about this for the entire day, I do have two of these great little board books. I have a third one. I'm not sure where she is right now. But these are from the Little Legends series, and they're Hawaiian legends. And so this is Maui Slows the Sun, and this one is Hina. So I, of course, being from Maui, love Maui Slows the Sun. And it just tells the story of how Maui reigned in the sun so that it is beautiful and bright and warm in Hawaii all of the time. So these are my Native Hawaiian, Native American resources. I do want to move now into more of African American and Latinx resources. So again, I'm going to do these kind of in backwards order where I start with the oldest book first, or the oldest demographic first, and then move into kind of the youngest bits. Now, you'll, again, like I said, you're going to see a theme. So I do have an African American and Latinx History of the United States by Paul Ortiz. And this book, just like the others that I have shown in this video and the video previously, these are basically just a chronological timeline from the very beginning until now. This I would consider to be a grown-up or an adult read, although it would also be appropriate for high school, and some portions of this may be appropriate for reading aloud to younger audiences as well. There is not, as far as I have been able to find, yet a for young readers version of this book. But it's great, like I said, for educating yourself, discovering the timeline, and then pulling your own resources. Since there is not a young reader's version, I've kind of pulled this little stack of my favorite things to use for kind of those middle grades. So as always, the Who Was books are fabulous all the time, always wonderful, always recommend. I have quite a few of these. I just pulled a couple. So Who Was Harriet Tubman, as well as Who Was Rosa Parks, and Who Was Martin Luther King Jr. These are, of course, you know, well-known and beloved figures in Black history. And I have said previously that I always love how honest the Who Was books are. I do think that they do a really good job of telling the real and true story. So always recommend those. You could gather those for any period of history or any person that you wanted to talk about. There are about 1 million of them. Also, for kind of young readers, things like these leveled readers, Ruby Bridges Goes to School, and then also Martin Luther King Jr. and the March on Washington. This book is called Dream March. This is a level 3. This one is a level 2. And so you can find all throughout these leveled readers, several different companies make them. You can find narratives that you may want to share. And then I have talked about these in a couple of different videos, but we also have the Little Leaders books. And so we have Bold Women in Black History, as well as Exceptional Men in Black History. And these books are rated for ages 9 to 12. I have used them this year as a read aloud for my 4-year-old, and I have used them as independent reading for a 10-year-old. They have pretty much the same format all the way throughout, which is one full page of text followed by an image. And again, this would be a place where I would print some of the colored pages or the printables, crafts or activities, and sort of pair them up with the names. I think, if I recall correctly, that there are about 40 in each book. I might be wrong about that. I didn't look before setting up the camera, but there are enough, I think, to probably make it through the school year. We have made it through the school year with the 4-year-old doing a read aloud twice a week on these 2 books so far. And then, of course, let's not leave out the board books. I do have a few board books for the very youngest of readers. I have Selena, who was a Mexican-American who grew up in Texas and became a Tejano music star, really broke into a market where a lot of women were not making music on the scene at that time. Really remarkable story. Love Selena. And also I have Frida, which reminds me that I forgot to pull my other Frida books. I also wanted to show you Who Was Frida Kahlo, as well as the story of Frida Kahlo. I'll link them below, although I forgot to pull them into the video. Those, I would say, are for those middle grade readers like the other books that I just showed. This is a board book version of Frida, and it's counting. Frida, of course, was a Mexican artist and painter who experienced a lot of tragedy in her life, lived for a pretty solid period of time in New York City, as well as on the west coast of the United States, in various places across the United States, and really changed the world of art. Did some exhibits here in New York that have really changed the way that we view art. I was going to say that really brought surrealism to the forefront, but I know that Frida Kahlo herself did not like being called a surrealist, so I'm trying to edit my words and not speak for her. She said she didn't paint surrealism, she painted her own life and the dichotomies that existed, her jubilation and her pain. So she did not like being called a surrealist. I also have The Story of Rap. This is a really sweet little board book, and it does talk about lots of notable people. The back says, from Grandmaster Flash to Kendrick Lamar. So this does talk about some notable names in rap and a lot of innovation, musical innovation that has come through this particular genre of music. So those are the resources that I have specifically related to Black history, kind of for a wide range. I want to show you one last thing that I have here. So I'm hoping this is going to be a summer read for us. This is still history. And so what I have is, I'm running out of room to put books. What I have is actually Becoming by Michelle Obama. I have wanted to read this book for quite some time. I feel like I've been so busy reading homeschool things this year that I have not been able to do a lot of personal reading, but I am really excited to read this in the coming days. I absolutely have such a deep wealth of respect for Michelle Obama. They did also come out with Becoming adapted for young readers, which, again, like the other books that we've seen, I would mark this as high school, maybe middle school, some segments appropriate for reading aloud to younger audiences. I did also then pick up Who is Michelle Obama from the Who Is series of books. And again, this is like that middle grades kind of a reader. And then I have this great little board book, I Look Up to Michelle Obama. This book talks about some of the amazing character traits of Michelle Obama and also many of the contributions that she made to our country as First Lady. It was Michelle Obama who famously said, in reference to her time spent in the White House, "I wake up every day in a house that was built by slaves." And this is a great reminder to me that history is happening right now. The things that we are doing today and the choices that we are making today are the things that are going to be in the pages of history for the generation that is to come. So we always want to make sure that we're making right choices, that we're telling the truth to the fullness of our ability, that we are ever working to bend the arc of justice towards freedom. It is my sincere hope that this has been helpful to you as you try to select resources for your own homeschool and home education. I have many more resources that I would have liked to have shared, but as always, time is a factor, and I knew that this video was going to be incredibly long as it was. So if you're watching this video and you have some resources that maybe I have left out, leave them in the comments below. Maybe people who come and watch this video can find even more resources there. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great week.